On a stretch of two-lane highway outside a small Texas town, a pregnant woman stood alone against three men, and every car before Chuck Norris had already driven past. Legend says he was the only one who stopped. Nobody filmed what happened in the 90 seconds that followed, but everyone who has ever told this story tells it the same way, down to the last detail. The woman survived. The three men never spoke of that night again, and the story has been passed hand to hand in martial arts circles ever since. Not as history, but as the kind of tale that gets told anyway, because some stories are too important to let die just because no one can prove them. It was late, the kind of late where the highway stops being a road and starts being a corridor of darkness, broken only by headlights that don't slow down. She was maybe 8 months along, her car dead on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly into the night like a heartbeat running out of charge. Three men had pulled over before Chuck Norris ever got there, not to help. Their truck sat crooked behind her car, engine still running, doors hanging open like they'd left in a hurry to reach her. They weren't strangers offering roadside assistance. Anyone who saw their body language, the way they'd fanned out, the way they'd boxed her against her own car door, understood immediately what kind of men they were. Here's what nobody understood yet. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't even really about her purse or her car. It was about power, the ugly kind. The kind that feeds on finding someone who can't run and can't fight back. Cars passed. 6 of them, maybe 7, in the time it took the situation to fully form. Headlights swept over the scene. A woman backed against a car door. 3 men closing in. And every single one of those cars sped up instead of slowing down. That's the part of the story people always go quiet on. Not the men, not even the danger. The fact that help drove right past her, again and again, and kept going. Then a truck slowed down. Just one. Chuck Norris didn't know these people. He wasn't looking for trouble that night. He was driving home from visiting family, tired, the radio low, thinking about nothing in particular the way you do on a long, straight road at midnight. But he saw what the other drivers saw. The difference was, he didn't drive past it. He pulled onto the shoulder maybe 40 yards back and let his headlights wash over the 3 men. That alone should have been enough to send most people running. A witness, a stranger, someone who could describe their faces to police. It wasn't enough. That's the thing about men like this. They don't calculate risk the way frightened people do. They calculate size. And Chuck Norris, in the dark, in work boots and a plain jacket, looked like exactly the kind of man they figured they could handle. Rhetorical question worth asking here. Why didn't they just leave the second another car showed up? Because 3 against 1 has always felt like safe math to men who've never had that math fail on them before. They had no idea they were about to become the exception that gets whispered about in gyms for the next few decades. The woman would later describe it simply, that one of them had grabbed her arm, that she'd frozen, that in her mind she'd already started saying goodbye to whatever was about to happen to her and her unborn child. And then, she said, she heard boots on gravel, slow, unhurried, like whoever was walking toward them wasn't afraid of anything they could possibly do. The first thing Chuck Norris said wasn't a threat. Witnesses, the woman, later, and allegedly one of the men himself, years afterward, in a confession nobody ever officially recorded, say his first words were almost gentle. "Let her go. This doesn't have to go any further." The 3 men laughed. Of course they did. That's what men like this always do first. Laugh, posture, size up the stranger who just wandered into what they thought was their moment. One of them stepped forward, chest out, the universal language of a man who has never once lost a fight he started. He said something about minding his own business, something about how there were 3 of them and 1 of him, like the math itself was supposed to be the argument. Chuck Norris didn't answer that. He didn't need to. He simply took 1 more step forward, into the wash of his own headlights, close enough now that they could see his face wasn't afraid. And somewhere in that half second, something shifted in the air. The kind of shift you only recognize afterward, once it's too late to undo. The pregnant woman would say later that this was the strangest part, not the violence that came after, the quiet before it. The way the loudest of the 3 men suddenly stopped talking, the way his friends glanced at each other instead of at Chuck Norris, like some instinct older than logic was telling them to run, and their pride wouldn't let them listen. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be argued about in dojos and diners for years afterward. Not whether it happened, but exactly how. One of the men lunged first. That's the detail everyone agrees on. Fear does that to men who've cornered themselves with their own bravado. It makes them attack the thing they're afraid of, because standing still feels worse than moving. He came in wide, sloppy, throwing his whole body behind a punch that was built for hitting someone who wouldn't move. Chuck Norris moved. The second man came from the side, thinking numbers would matter, thinking the first attack had opened a window. The third stayed back near the woman for one more second, one crucial second, as if some small part of him already understood that whatever was happening in front of him wasn't going to end the way he'd planned when he first pulled over. The woman pressed herself against her car and watched three grown men who'd seemed unstoppable 90 seconds earlier suddenly look like they'd wandered into something far bigger than themselves. Every observer of this story, and there are more of them than you'd expect, for something that supposedly happened on an empty road at midnight, agrees on this. The fight, when it actually began, was shorter than anyone standing there expected, shorter than the men themselves expected. Some legends stretch out the violence for drama. This one doesn't need to. The truth, or the myth of the truth, is that it was already close to over before it properly started. 3 seconds. That's the number that survives in every version of this story, whispered in gyms from Texas to California. 3 seconds between the first man's fist leaving his shoulder and the first man hitting the gravel. Chuck Norris slipped the wide punch by turning his hip, letting the man's own momentum carry him past, and drove a short elbow into his ribs on the way by. Not a haymaker, not a movie punch, just precise, economical force, delivered exactly where it needed to go. The man folded and dropped, the air gone out of him before he even understood he'd been hit. The second man was already committing to his angle, and Chuck Norris used that against him. A low sweep to the ankle that turned confident forward motion into a face-first collapse onto the shoulder of the road. No wasted movement, no theatrics, just the brutal efficiency of someone who has spent a lifetime making sure fights end quickly, because quick is safer for everyone involved, including, especially, the woman standing 3 feet away with her arms wrapped around her stomach. The third man never threw a punch at all. By the time he processed what had happened to his friends, Chuck Norris was already standing between him and the woman, close enough that the man could see there was no anger in his face. That was somehow worse than anger would have been. Anger at least burns out. This was calm. This looked like a man who had already decided how the next 10 seconds were going to go, and wasn't the slightest bit interested in negotiating. The third man raised his hands, not to fight, but to show they were empty, and took 2 steps back toward the truck. Nobody had to tell him twice what was good for him. 4 seconds. Maybe 5, counting the moment it took the second man to hit the ground. That's the entire fight, as the story has always been told. No extended battle, no dramatic comeback, just skill meeting arrogance, and arrogance losing, the way it almost always does when the stakes are real instead of imagined. The 2 men on the ground didn't get up right away. One of them would later admit, in the version of the story that made its way into dojo folklore, that he genuinely believed for a moment that something had broken inside him. Not from any single strike, but from how completely and instantly his sense of control over the situation had disappeared. The third man helped his friends back to their truck without a word. No apologies, no excuses. Just 3 men who'd arrived that night certain of their own power, leaving with an understanding that would apparently follow them for the rest of their lives, according to how the tale is told, that some strangers on empty roads are exactly what they appear to be, and some are something else entirely, and you never find out which until it's too late to matter. The woman, shaking, tried to thank him. The story says he waved it off. Something short, almost dismissive, along the lines of, just get home safe. No lecture, no demand for her story or her name. He waited with her until a tow truck arrived, checked that her hazards were still working, and then he was gone into the dark the same way he'd appeared out of it. Quietly, without ceremony. No police report survives that names him. No dashcam footage has ever surfaced. Only 8 people, by most tellings, ever really knew what happened that night on that stretch of highway. The woman, the three men, and whoever she eventually told the story to over the years that followed. That's how it always spreads, this kind of legend. Not through headlines, through the quiet retelling of someone who was there, passed to someone who wasn't, until it belongs to everyone who's ever needed to believe that help sometimes still shows up when nobody else will stop. There's a reason this story has outlived the specifics of the night it supposedly happened. It was never really about three men on a dark road. It was about the idea that size and numbers mean nothing against someone who has trained his whole life not to need them. That real strength has never been about how big you look standing in someone's headlights, but about what you're willing to do the moment those headlights become the only light left for someone who has none. Whether every detail happened exactly the way it's been told, this much has never changed in any version of the story. Everyone else drove past that night. Only one car stopped. And somewhere out there, the story says, is a woman and a child who exist today because one stranger decided that driving past wasn't an option he was willing to live with. That's the legend. That's why it's still told. If you want more stories like this one, legends of quiet strength showing up exactly when it's needed most, subscribe and we'll keep bringing them to you.